Right, what do we have here? Power supply, big letters, must be important. Ching Liang! Don't know if that's good or bad. Oh, as long as it doesn't let the smoke out, I don't mind. Ladies, gentlemen, children of all ages, welcome back to Make, Repair, Recycle, where today we will be unboxing, building and attempting to print our first 3D item using this new 3D printer. Hiding inside this lovely brown box all the way from the land of infinite manufacturing possibilities, Shenzhen in China, comes a Creality Ender 3. Now, buying and building a 3D printer was not on my radar until I was snoozing off a Christmas food and drink coma, scrolling through my phone and came across a BangGood offer. This kit form 3D printer cost me the minuscule price of £123.37, including shipping, dispatched to me from a UK warehouse, so none of that stuck at Dover malarkey. Within 3 days it arrived, and that was over New Year as well, which I think is pretty good going, to be honest. Let's hope what is in here is a Creality Ender 3 and not some half-scale model. As you probably will have worked out from the title of this video, I am a complete noob when it comes to this, so hopefully, you might find this experience of me trying to put this thing together and make it work useful. Since ordering this, I've discovered there's a lot of things online that you can then print out and upgrade it with. There's all kinds of mods and hop-ups and all sorts of weird and wonderful things to make it better. It's open source as well, which is even better. And websites like Thingiverse have got all kinds of nice doodads and widgets you can print with the thing. So let's get cracking and get on with it. Right then, lovely people, let's get the sharp pointy end out and get this thing open. Specifically cut styrofoam. Ooh, look at this. I was not expecting this, if I'm honest. Wow. I was expecting the usual kind of bubble wrap, inflated things, and wow. Look at that. I really was genuinely very surprised at how well this had been packaged and put together. Indeed, some of the parts were so difficult to get out of the foam, the easiest thing was just to lift the whole foam tray out in one go and then separate the pieces from there. As you can see, everything is extremely well packaged. All of the little cut slots work perfectly and nothing moved in transit from China at all. In fact, the only thing that really happened was one of the bed levelling wheels had dropped off. Apart from that, everything else was in tip-top condition. Scrapey sharpy thing. I've seen this, they do give you this. This is to scrape the parts off. And clearly, it's very importantly 38mm. That's obviously important. Although you could class this as a kit build printer, there is quite a lot of it that's already been put together. More pipes and parts. Oh, and a little bit of filament. That's handy because do you know what? I haven't bought any yet. Yeah, that would have been useful, wouldn't it? Never mind. And cable ties, screws, Allen keys. You've got the whole lot in here. Belt. Label nuts and oh, that's nice. Well, do you know what? So far, I'm impressed. Right, let's get rid of this box. So let's see what we've got here. We've got a fully assembled base frame, which is quite nice, and the plate seems like, although there is a very loud. It looks like a centre point in this, which I'm not sure if that's supposed to be there or not, but I guess we'll find that out, won't we? Base frame is assembled. It's already wired and assembled with the extruder end, which is nice. There's no assembly work with that. Aluminium sections. Whoop, let's not lose that. With that, I think, is the drive screw for the that axis. Which one? Z. There we go. That's good. I'm learning as we go. Here is the drive and the feed for the filament wire with limit switches and things. We've got a power supply, we've got the controller for the front of it, we've got screws. We appear to have here some Industry English and an SD card. Now I had read on some websites that contains all the information you need, and it's also the way that you get the files into the little slot down here through a SD card. And we've got power leads, and we've got scrapers and everything. So this seems to be it. Let's see what's in here. After sales service card, basic parameters. Oh look at that, a qualified certificate. Always like one of those. Industry printer instructions for us. Oh look, I printed. I didn't think I was going to get printed instructions. I thought it was going to point me to something on the internet. You know what, I'm starting to think this is a reasonably proper machine for a bargain price. Right, so I think we've got everything. So the next thing to do is break out the tools and start screwing things together. And so the assembly begins by installing the vertical Z-axis rails onto the base frame. The aluminium extrusion parts have already been pre-drilled and tapped with threads, which is nice. So all you've got to do is get them in the right place and put the screws in. The extrusion looks like it's been cut nicely square and straight, so it should line up really well when the axis is put together. And because these are aluminium, it's really not worth stripping the threads out, so they only need to be done up nicely hand tight. With the two uprights now in place, it's time to put the power supply in. This is fitted to the right hand upright. Two holes have already been cut into the bar, so all you've got to do is put the screws through and tighten it into the power supply. The base of the power supply doesn't actually rest on the base frame of the printer. It actually sits a little bit higher, which does leave space for the power supply cable to come out the back. Next up comes fitting the display panel. This is bolted in to the right hand corner of the base frame using two bolts. With step 2 complete, next item to fit is the Z-axis limit switch. This comes pre-assembled on its own little mounting plate, complete with fixings. Now in the instructions there is clearly a dimension of 32mm between the bottom of the frame and what looks like the bottom of the limit switch bracket. For trying to keep this as accurate as possible, I even broke out the digital vernier, all 799 of it, to see if I could get this accurately placed. However, when fitting it, it was quite obvious that was never going to happen. The end of the plate has a small return on it, which looks like it rests on the horizontal crossbar at the bottom. So there's really only one place to fit it. The Z-axis stepper motor is next. This has a small plastic bracket already screwed to it to allow mounting to the vertical aluminium extrusion. The stepper motor and the plastic bracket are mounted to the aluminium extrusion using countersunk screws. Now, there is a fair amount of play in this, which comes in quite handy in a minute when it comes to alignment. Now comes the trickiest job of the whole assembly, putting together the X-axis, complete with the extruder head and the filament drive motor. Now in fairness here, the diagrams could be a little bit clearer in terms of the location of the bar against the pre-assembled drive unit, but after a few minutes of turning it round and round and round and round again, it eventually worked out where the bolt holes were. The fixing holes in the X-axis bar have already been drilled and tapped, which is nice. However, holding the assembled drive unit and the bar and the screws and the Allen key does require a couple of octopus-like limbs, an extra helper, or just some magic. So after a few minutes of jigging and poking, eventually managed to get the screws in. Now cleverly, there's another pair of holes on the opposite plate, so the Allen key can fit straight through. Clever. With the drive unit subassembly now attached to the bar, the next item to fit is the compression fitting for the end of the Bowden tube. This gets screwed in to the top of the feed unit, and it only really needs to be finger tight. This fitting then accepts the white plastic tube, known as a Bowden tube, which acts as the filament guide and guides the filament through the drive unit out into the extruder head. There's a blue plastic collar which goes onto the end of the fitting and holds it in place once the tube's been inserted. And while I've got the drive unit in my hands, you can see where the filament goes through. The filament is trapped between the brass wheel and the silver one. The brass wheel is attached to the stepper motor and pulls the filament through and then pushes it out through the Bowden tube into the extruder head. There's a spare of one of these fittings in the kit, together with another nozzle. The next piece in the puzzle is fitting the bracket on the other end of the bar so it can slide up and down the vertical bar on the frame. As with the other end, there's already two tapped holes, so it just needs screwing together. Now what I should have actually done is put the extruder head on first, because in a moment you'll see I have to unscrew this to loosen it to then get the extruder head sliding along the bar. As the extruder head is already pre-assembled, it just needs sliding on. And then the bracket at the other end can be tightened back up again. Next we need to put the tensioner assembly on. This has already come pre-assembled in the kit, but you will need to loosen off the nuts and the screws if they've been done up super tight. The last piece of assembly for the X-axis bar is putting the drive belt on. On the underside of the rolling extruder head, there's two slots. Now on the end of the belt, there's a pair of crimped ferrules, and those slide into the grooves and capture the belt. The belt actually runs in the V-groove slot in the aluminium extrusion, so it sits under the rollers of the extruder head. And that's the X-axis bar, all finished. Before we can put the X-axis bar onto the rest of the frame, we need to attach the lead screw that provides the Z-axis. This drives the X-axis subassembly bar up and down, giving you the height change. The aluminium coupling came as part of the kit already attached to the stepper motor, so all you need to do is drop the lead screw in and tighten up the grub screw. With the lead screw now attached to the stepper motor, it will be fairly obvious if the stepper motor and the lead screw aren't perfectly vertical. Luckily, there's plenty of movement in the countersunk screws on the little plastic bracket attached to the stepper motor to adjust this to get it in line. The lead screw goes into this brass captive nut next to the feed unit assembly. The whole thing can then be slid onto the vertical bars of the frame. With the lead screw engaged, you can then turn it and wind the X-axis bar, or the Z-axis, up and down, and do make sure you get both ends on properly, not like I did here. To check the alignment of the lead screw, I wound it all the way from top to bottom to make sure it moved smoothly, which in my case, it did. With the Z-axis now working on the lead screw, we can now start to look at the bed height and bed levelling. The limit switch and plate we added earlier touch on the bottom of the framework of the Z-axis. This tells the controller when the Z-axis is in its lowest and home position when it triggers the little micro switch. You can see here that I've wound the bed all the way down as pretty much as low as it will go. So then we can wind the lead screw on the Z-axis down and trigger the micro switch so we know where the home position is, knowing that the extruder tip isn't going to smash into the bed. The mechanical framework is almost finished, and step 10 is putting the top bar on, or handle as it's otherwise known. These are the M5 playmat. Now it's always important to read the instructions, unlike I did here. The top bar has got 4 holes in it where the screws go through to attach to the rest of the frame. On one side there's a counterbore that the screw head goes into. Whatever you do, don't try and fit it upside down and wind the screws into the V-slot. That's not going to work. The last piece of the mechanical puzzle is to put the spool holder on the top of the frame. The main tube passes through a hole in the bracket and is kept in place with a lock nut that does up on a quarter turn. The slot nuts and bolts for this come in a little bag, so they'll need sub-assembling onto the metal bracket and then they can be slid in place into the bar. The last assembly step is to just plug all the connectors together. This has been made a lot simpler because every cable has a little identification mark on it, which is really helpful. The only one that was slightly confusing was the X-axis, as there's 2 cables with the X-axis markers on. But looking at the 2 places where they go, the stepper motor has a 4-wire connection and the limit switch has a 3-wire connection, so it's pretty straightforward really. Whoops, forgot to tighten those screws up. Never mind. The last cable to put on was the ribbon connector to the display panel. On the back of the circuit board there's 3 identically sized plugs. And from the instructions it says it needs to go into EXP3, which is on the far left hand side. So there you have it. In a matter of minutes, a fully assembled Ender 3 ready to start tinkering with. And that's where the printed instructions finish. So let's have a look on the memory card and see what other goodies we've got. On the memory stick you'll find a number of files and folders. Firstly, there's a copy of the user manual that was printed out as part of the kit. I guess it's handy in case you lose the printed one. But next to that you'll find the user manual Ender 3, and this contains the next set of instructions for how to actually use the machine. This file contains all the information that you'll need to control the machine using the display panel and the little control wheel on the front of it, how to install the filament, and how to level the bed. It also shows you how to install the software that's packaged with the machine, Creality's own slicing software. As long as you pick the right machine from the list, you're okay. It finally gives you the instructions that are fairly straightforward for taking the model file you've created, the G-code file, and sticking it in the printer. There's also a couple of files on troubleshooting and problem solving, which of course I'm never going to use. And lastly, there are some model files and some G-code that you can use to print off your first item. Now, I'm not going to use any of those because the first thing I want to print is actually something useful for the machine. So, next thing to look at then is the slicing software. So when you open up the Creality software for the first time, what you'll see is a kind of 3D representation of the print bed of the machine, which you can zoom in and out and spin around. There's also a few settings off on the left there, material you could be using, and whether you want it fast, which will produce a thicker layer height, or whether you want more high quality, which uses a thinner layer height. So clicking the folder option on the top left, you can open a file that's downloaded onto your machine. The example here is a filament guide bracket that I downloaded from Thingiverse. You've also got options for rotating, scaling or mirroring parts, which is really handy if you want to make something that's handed and can't really be bothered to go through the whole process of redrawing the whole thing in CAD. Every time you move it or do something with it, it will reprogram itself and work out how long it's going to take you to print based on the settings that you've selected. Using the controls you can move the item around on the bed, and obviously if you had other things to print you could load the bed up with more stuff. Now the settings here are pretty basic and simplistic, but if this is your first machine like mine, that's probably all I need for the minute. But there are options to go into the full settings, which gives you much more control over the feed rate, the filament, nozzle size, extrusion size and everything else. Now for this first print, I'm going to leave all those things exactly where they are, as to be honest, I've only got a limited amount of knowledge of what the hell any of them do. But in fairness to Creality, it does give you tooltips on everything you hover over, so even a numpty like me could probably work out what any of them do. What effects they have on the print, well I guess I'll just have to print more stuff at different settings and find out. So after fiddling around looking at settings that I don't really have any clue what they're going to do, you hit the download button and you save the G-code file to the USB stick. Pop the memory card into the printer, follow the instructions, and you're off! With the machine built, a G-code file created, the last thing to do is to bevel the bed and get the filament in. So let's start with bed leveling. First thing we need to do is to go into the Prepare menu and then down to Auto Home. The Ender 3 will then move all of its 3 axes down to their home position, or their 0 point if you like. This means the machine now knows exactly where all the axes are, they're all at their own 0 points. And then from there it can then work out how many steps to move forward, backwards, left, right, up or down. And it was at this point we found a problem. Who said they wouldn't need the troubleshooting guide? Never mind. So, best do some power cycling and turn it off and on again. Now earlier in the mechanical build I had noticed that the bed did seem to be sticking in places, almost like there was a flat spot or a bearing or something, and clearly the drive motor and the belt in that particular axis was having a rather tough time trying to pull it back to its home position. So, time to get the spanners out. This was clearly getting stuck, and it felt like it was almost like I had a flat spot somewhere in one of the rollers where it was then just binding solid. Now, having taken the heat plate off the top and looking at this, these rollers, the V-groove rollers, sit in the groove in the extrusion and run up and down. However, they were extremely tight, and so I don't know whether it was just exposing a flat spot somewhere, or maybe the wheels aren't quite perfectly round, but it was absolutely solid. So I've still got a little bit of, still not quite tight enough, it's a little bit loose, but you can play around with these and work on the clamping pressure. So with a little bit more fiddling, hopefully I can get that to a point where it's tight and it runs, but it's not loose and rocking about and falling off. So, getting there. So the plate's now back together, and it's, as you can see, it's sliding without any of those jerks and stops. The rollers in there were just too tight. Now that could well be that they were done up really tight for shipping, so that the base plate didn't fly around. But because that was too tight, it couldn't travel back to its home position using in the home program. So it just had a bit of a meltdown and went, oh, I can't go any further. So with this, we'll fire it up again. The point of doing the home first is it returns everything back to zero. So all three axes go back to zero, and then it knows where all of the elements are, so it can control it going forward. So, having put the bed back on, I've now wound it up fairly tight so it's out the way, so when this goes to its home position based on that limit switch, it should still be proud of the bed. And then what we'll do is we'll level it with a sheet of paper so that the bed is flat and just clear enough that the sheet of paper fits under it. If we hit the button and we go into prepare, down to auto home, what we will then see is all three axes start to move, find their home position, and then it will reset a couple of times just to make sure that it knows where the home position is specifically. You can see it move in and out a couple of times. And there we go. So now it's found that 0 point, what we need to do is to level the bed. Based on the instructions, we go down to prepare and we say distable steppers. Now what that means is that we've got control over the axes manually, so we can then pull them and move them. So what we do is we put a piece of paper between the nozzle that you can just see in there and the bed, and then we wind the screw out until it just starts to drag on the sheet of paper. So that knows that in that corner, it's just starting to catch there. It's moving. So that's just, you just feel it dragging with your fingertips. So there's the thickness of a sheet of paper trapped in there. So then what I'm going to do is hopefully pull this forward, yeah, and the back corner is slightly out. So again, we'll pop the sheet of paper under there and just wind this out. Now this might be a feel thing that you develop over time if you know it's a little bit too tight or a bit too far away. Just feel it drag. Then all you need to do is carry on going round all four corners. Because we were setting this up for the first time, it's probably worth going round all four corners once more, just to make sure that adjusting one corner hasn't upset the other side. Hopefully, we've now got one nicely level bed. Ooh, it's starting to get exciting now. Next thing to do is put the filament in. And to do that, you need to go into the control screen and then into temperature and set the nozzle temperature to about 200. And if you go back to the main screen, the nozzle temperature, which is the bit next to where it says Ender 3, has the target temperature at the top and the actual temperature at the bottom. So as you can see here, mine was already at 200. So having bought myself a roll of bright orange PLA filament, I can now start stuffing it into the machine. Having unwound it off the spool holder on the top, you then need to pass it into this small brass round hole. Pinching the spring will hold the tension roller away far enough so you can pass the filament through the middle, and then into the Bowden tube, and then on into the extruder head. As the extruder nozzle is already at 200 degrees, as you push the filament in, it'll start to ooze out the nozzle. Give it a good squirt, and then clip off the excess, and your machine is ready to go. And so here is the first print of the model we looked at earlier. Now this is a filament guide that goes onto the top of the framework, and this will ensure that it just makes the filament take a slightly more rounded arc into the feed head and stop it from rubbing on that little brass ferrule. Now this took a minute under 2 hours to print. Based on the settings we looked at earlier, I left this at about 0.2 layer height. Didn't really touch anything else, and to be fair, it printed flawlessly first time. Now once this is finished, you've got to try and get it off the bed. Now you want some good adhesion to hold the model to the bed because you don't want the thing sliding around or falling off or losing its shape. However, in this instance, it was well and truly stuck on there. The bed as it comes is held on with bulldog clips, which means you can take the clips off and the plastic sheet is quite flexible, so you can then pop the part off, and as you can see, looks pretty good. Although I haven't got anything directly to compare it with, but you know, it looks like the model, so that's good. So let's now see if it fits. The first part goes into the end of the extrusion, and then the little curvy arm slides into the top. And as you can see, it's a perfect fit. So with the printer built and our first item printed, what do I think of the Creality Ender 3? Well, here are the good points. Well, firstly, let's look at the packaging. As we saw at the beginning of the video when we opened the box, It's been tremendously well packaged. All of that die-cut foam specific for the items that they're containing mean that it should arrive wherever it goes in the world in the same way it left the factory, and it shows that they've taken some care and some thought about the product and how it's presented, and will it arrive in the same way it left the factory, which is all good. Then there's the kit itself, and in the kit there is absolutely everything you need to make this work. All the Allen keys, all the screws, even spare screws, spare bolts, which shows a real attention to detail that even if you do manage to drop one and it rolls underneath your desk or behind the sofa, you can still finish the kit without having to go and look for nuts and bolts and Alibaba. And you couldn't put the kit together if you didn't have the instructions, and I have to say the instructions in this were pretty damn good. They could be clearer in a couple of places, but let's face it, for a complete noob here with something like this, we've managed to build it and put it together, and it worked. And they've included circuit board diagrams, troubleshooting workflows, and hints and tips if it does stop working. So again, it shows that Creality have spent a little bit of time thinking about the people that might want to use this, and if they do get into problems, how they can get it working again. And then, having followed all of the instructions, you've got to control the thing to get it to print the item that you want, and the controls in this do seem fairly intuitive. The instructions are nice and clear into how to use it, but to be honest, a little time poking around and jabbing at the little button and you can find what you need to make it work. I have read a few places where people have said they don't like how loud the button click is, which seems a bit odd. You know, it's a knob, it clicks, got a little bit of feedback, works fine as far as I'm concerned. And bearing all of that in mind, I think I would call this fairly easy to set up. I think without the filming of this, I've probably got to have this built in an hour and printing in probably under an hour and a half if I had the filament to hand at the time. So for what I paid for it, I think this is an absolutely blinding machine, and hopefully it continues to work in the same way it has done so far. Now, that's not to say there aren't one or two bad points on this that, if these were polished off, would make this an absolute belter of a machine. Firstly, the spool holder. Now, as you may notice from the image on screen, there is a plastic bag over the spool holder because there was just too much friction between the weight of the spool of filament, the drum of filament, and it wasn't spinning, so it was just sort of binding up tight, and it just needs a little less friction and it rolls fine. Obviously, in the middle of the build, when we started to put the home program together, we saw that the bed was too tight and it just wasn't moving back and forth and made that horrendous noise. Again, that may be something that was in there as part of shipping so it doesn't slide around, which I can entirely understand, and 5 minutes with the right tools to loosen it off and put it back on again, and it was fine again. Although there are a couple of bad points, they're by no means insurmountable. And I would most definitely recommend somebody getting one of these if they're interested in starting on 3D printing, much like myself, just to see whether it's worth doing anything more with, because I think this is going to do pretty well for me. So if you're interested in making, recycling or repairing stuff, 3D printing as we have discovered today, and indeed making DIY sim wheels, something else I'm still working on, together with a whole raft of other things that will be coming in 2021, please hit subscribe, like, hit the bell, and do leave a comment. It's nice to hear from people who enjoy the same things. So thanks for watching, see you next time.